She looked like she didn't belong. Scuffed flats, a wrinkled shirt, and a violin wrapped in old cloth. Laughter erupted the moment she stepped in. Did janitorial staff get lost? Is this a music audition or a charity casting call? Someone tossed her a plastic chair. Save the leather ones for real musicians. A student shoved a dusty, out-of-tune practice violin into her hands. Let's hear what a supermarket cart sounds like. She said nothing. She just sat down and played. By the third note, the room froze. What they thought was trash had just made the walls tremble. The auditorium of the prestigious Harmony Conservatory hummed with anticipation, its velvet seats filled with polished performers clutching gleaming instruments. At the back of the room, almost invisible against the grandeur, sat Elena Harper. Her plain linen dress, slightly frayed at the hem, hung loosely on her slender frame. Her old canvas shoes, scuffed and faded, peeked out beneath the fabric. Her dark hair fell in soft, unstyled waves over her shoulders, framing a face that was striking in its simplicity, beautiful, but deliberately unadorned. At 19, Elena carried herself with a quiet strength, her hazel eyes scanning the room with calm observation. Today was the conservatory's annual audition for the International Showcase, a performance that could launch a musician's career onto the global stage. The room buzzed with nervous energy as students whispered about who might secure the coveted solo spot. Elena, however, sat alone, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a worn violin case resting at her feet. She wasn't here to chase fame. She was here for something far more personal. Across the aisle, Professor Margaret Stein, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for ruthless standards, leaned toward her colleague, Dr. Lawrence Brooks. Her gaze landed on Elena, and a smirk tugged at her lips. "Look at that one," she murmured, nodding toward the back row. Bold of her to think that dress belongs under stage lights. Dr. Brooks, a wiry man with a penchant for cutting remarks, followed her gaze and chuckled. "What's next? Auditioning in a potato sack?" Their laughter drew attention, and soon whispers rippled through the room. Students turned to glance at Elena, their expressions a mix of pity and amusement. A few covered their mouths to hide their grins. Elena's face remained composed, though her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her violin case. She'd faced judgment before, countless times in fact. It wasn't new, but it still stung. In the front row, Caleb Warner, a violin prodigy with slicked-back hair and a tailored blazer, caught wind of the mockery. His reputation as the conservatory's golden boy was well-earned, but so was his arrogance. He leaned toward his friend Sophie Kendall, a flutist with a sharp tongue, and smirked. "She looks like she wandered in from a thrift store," Caleb said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "What's she even doing here?" Sophie giggled, tossing her glossy curls. "Probably lost on her way to a street performance." The room erupted in soft laughter, and Caleb's confidence swelled. He stood brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve and addressed the crowd with mock generosity. "To be fair," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "let's give her a chance, at least for our entertainment." The laughter grew louder, bolder. A few students clapped as if it were a performance in itself. As Elena crossed the room to retrieve her violin case, Sophie Kendall stood abruptly, her flute glinting under the chandeliers. "Hold on," she called out, her voice sharp and theatrical. "Let's make sure everyone gets a good look at our star performer." She gestured at Elena's dress with exaggerated pity, her lips curling into a sneer. "I mean, really, did you think this was a costume party? Or do you just not own a mirror?" The room roared with laughter, students pointing as Elena's cheeks flushed faintly, not from shame, but from the sheer weight of their malice. Sophie sat back down, triumphant, as whispers of pathetic and embarrassing slithered through the crowd. Elena's eyes flicked toward Caleb, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly as if studying him. Her silence only fueled the room's cruelty. Professor Stein raised an eyebrow, amused. "Well, Warner, since you're so charitable, why don't you fetch her an instrument? Let's see if she can at least hold a bow correctly." Caleb grinned and strode to a storage closet at the side of the stage. He returned with a dusty, neglected violin, its varnish chipped, its strings dull and slightly rusted. The instrument was a relic, one the conservatory hadn't bothered to maintain. He thrust it toward Elena with a theatrical bow. "Your Stradivarius, milady," he said, prompting another wave of laughter. Elena rose gracefully, her movements deliberate. She accepted the violin without a word, her fingers brushing the worn wood with a tenderness that went unnoticed by the jeering crowd. She carried it to the stage, her steps steady despite the weight of every eye in the room. The auditorium fell into a mocking hush, anticipation crackling like static. Before Elena could reach the stage, Professor Stein raised a hand, silencing the room with a single gesture, her eyes, cold as marble, fixed on Elena's modest figure. "Ms. Harper, is it?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I must commend your courage. Most people would know better than to waste our time with such a—" She paused, glancing at Elena's shoes. "Humble presentation." The word hung in the air like a slap, and a few students snickered, emboldened by her authority. Elena met her gaze without flinching, but the professor's words cut deeper than the laughter, a deliberate reminder that she was an outsider here. Dr. Brooks leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "This should be enlightening," he muttered. Sophie whispered to the girl beside her. $10 says she can't even play a scale." Elena stood alone under the spotlight, the harsh beam highlighting the simplicity of her appearance. She adjusted the violin's pegs with practiced ease, her fingers moving with a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the room's disdain. The strings, though out of tune, responded to her touch, and within moments she'd coaxed them into alignment. She tested the bow, drawing it lightly across the strings, and a faint, clear note cut through the silence. As Elena adjusted the violin's pegs, Caleb leaned forward in his seat, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "Careful with that relic," he mocked, standing to tower over the edge of the stage. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her, and flicked a speck of dust from his sleeve as if her presence dirtied the air. "Wouldn't want you to break it, or yourself, trying to impress us." A few of his friends laughed, egging him on, and he leaned in, his tone low but venomous. "Why don't you just quit now? Save us all the secondhand embarrassment." Elena's fingers paused briefly on the strings, but she didn't look up, her focus a shield against his looming presence. Caleb snorted from his seat. "Beginner's luck." Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if centering herself. As Elena lifted the violin to her chin, a murmur swept through the audience, growing into a chorus of whispered taunts. "She's actually going to try," one student hissed, loud enough for others to hear. Another added, "Bet she learned from YouTube tutorials." Someone in the back row mimicked a screeching violin, drawing stifled laughter that spread like wildfire. The sound swelled, a collective cruelty that seemed to press against Elena from all sides, daring her to falter. Yet she stood unmoved, her posture straight, her eyes closing briefly as if to shut out their voices, not in defeat, but in defiance. Then, without preamble, she drew the bow across the strings. The first note was soft but precise, a delicate thread of sound that seemed to hover in the air. The second note followed, richer and more commanding. By the third, the room went utterly silent. She launched into Sarasate's Carmen Fantasie, a piece notorious for its technical demands and fiery passion. The music poured from her like a storm, each note crisp, each phrase alive with intensity. Her bow danced across the strings, coaxing impossible clarity from the battered instrument. Her fingers flew through intricate passages, never faltering, never rushing. The melody surged and retreated, now playful, now heartbreaking, weaving a spell that held the audience captive. Professor Stein's smirk vanished. She sat forward, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Dr. Brooks's mouth fell open, his pen slipping from his fingers to clatter on the floor. Caleb's confident grin froze, then faded entirely. Sophie's eyes widened, her flute forgotten in her lap. Elena played as if the room didn't exist. Her body swayed slightly with the music, but her face remained serene, her focus absolute. The violin, despite its flaws, sang under her command, its voice raw but powerful. She navigated the piece's most treacherous runs with breathtaking precision, her phrasing imbued with a depth that spoke of years, decades of devotion. In the wings, a young assistant professor, Clara Nguyen, whispered to herself, That's how Menuhin used to play it." The final note rang out, sharp and triumphant, before fading into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then the auditorium erupted into applause, stunned, fervent, unstoppable. Students leapt to their feet, their earlier mockery forgotten. Even those who had laughed loudest clapped now, their faces a mix of awe and shame. Elena lowered the violin, her breath steady, her expression unchanged. She didn't bask in the applause or acknowledge the crowd's sudden adoration. She simply stood there, the dusty instrument cradled in her hands, waiting. Professor Stein was the first to speak, her voice unsteady. "Young lady, what is your name?" "Elena Harper," she replied softly, her tone polite but firm. Dr. Brooks stood, adjusting his glasses as if to see her more clearly. "Where did you train, Ms. Harper? That was extraordinary." The room leaned forward, hungry for her answer. Elena's lips curved into a small, almost wistful smile. "I was Professor Keller's last student," she said, "before he passed. I just wanted his music to keep living." The auditorium fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over them like a fog. Professor Samuel Keller had been a legend, a reclusive genius whose performances had redefined the violin for a generation. He was notorious for refusing formal students, claiming no one was worthy of his time. Whispers had circulated for years that he'd taken on a single apprentice in his final days, but no one knew who, or if the rumor was even true. Clara Nguyen gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Keller, you studied with Samuel Keller?" Elena nodded once, her eyes distant. "He taught me for 3 years, until the end." The panelists exchanged glances, their faces pale. Professor Stein's earlier amusement had evaporated, replaced by something akin to fear. Dr. Brooks sank back into his chair, muttering, "My God." Caleb shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenched into fists. Sophie stared at the floor, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The room's earlier cruelty now hung like a shadow, impossible to ignore. Professor Stein cleared her throat, struggling to regain her authority. "Ms. Harper, that was an exceptional performance. We'd like to offer you the solo position in the International Showcase. It's a rare opportunity." "Thank you," Elena interrupted gently, "but I'd rather not take the solo." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as if he couldn't comprehend her refusal. Elena continued, her voice steady but warm. "I'd like to propose something else. There are students out there who love music as much as I do but can't afford to study here. If I'm chosen for anything, I'd ask that the conservatory create a scholarship fund in Professor Keller's name, for them." The panelists blinked, caught off guard. Dr. Brooks recovered first, nodding slowly. "That's a generous request, Miss Harper. We'll take it under serious consideration." "It's not about generosity," Elena said, her gaze unwavering. "It's about what's right. Music shouldn't be locked behind a paywall." The room was quiet again, her words resonating with a clarity that shamed the earlier mockery. Clara Nguyen wiped a tear from her cheek, her expression one of quiet admiration. Professor Stein hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, we'll discuss the scholarship immediately. But, Ms. Harper, you must understand, you've earned a place here today. Your talent is undeniable." Elena inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than agreement. "Thank you. But I didn't come here to prove myself. I came to honor my teacher." With that, she stepped off the stage, her violin still in hand. The applause followed her, softer now, almost reverent. As she passed the front row, Caleb averted his eyes, his jaw tight. Sophie twisted her flute in her hands, unable to meet Elena's gaze. In the days that followed, the conservatory was abuzz with Elena's performance. Students recounted the audition in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the memory. The panel convened an emergency meeting, and within a week, the Samuel Keller Scholarship Fund was announced, a full-ride program for talented musicians from underserved communities. Elena's name was attached to the initiative, though she'd insisted it honor Keller alone. The fallout for those who had mocked her was swift and contained. Caleb Warner was suspended for a semester, his misconduct deemed a violation of the conservatory's code of conduct. The day after the audition, the conservatory's main hall was packed for an emergency assembly. Caleb Warner stood before the faculty, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a flush of humiliation. Professor Stein, her face grim, announced his suspension to the silent crowd. "Your actions disgraced this institution," she said, her voice cutting through the air. "You mocked a peer whose talent surpasses your own, and for that, you'll spend a semester reflecting off campus." Caleb's eyes darted to the floor, the weight of every gaze crushing his pride. Whispers followed him as he left, the golden boy now a cautionary tale, his future at Harmony hanging by a thread. Sophie Kendall faced a similar penalty, her scholarship placed under review. Sophie Kendall's reckoning came during a closed-door meeting with the conservatory's disciplinary board. Her scholarship, once a point of pride, was now in jeopardy, her flute performances overshadowed by her role in Elena's humiliation. Dr. Brooks, who had chuckled at her taunts, now sat stone-faced as he read the board's decision. Her funding was under probation, her reinstatement contingent on a public apology and mandatory ethics training. Sophie's hands trembled as she left the room, her sharp tongue silenced, her status among her peers crumbling. The news spread quickly, a stark reminder that talent alone couldn't erase cruelty. Professor Stein and Dr. Brooks issued public apologies, their words carefully crafted but sincere. The conservatory's culture shifted, if only slightly, as students whispered about the girl who'd turned their world upside down. Elena, meanwhile, continued her studies quietly. She attended classes, practiced in empty rehearsal rooms, and declined every interview request that came her way. When asked why she'd refused the solo, she'd only say, "The music matters more than the stage." One evening, as she left the conservatory, a younger student, a timid pianist named Lily, approached her. "Elena," she said hesitantly, "I was there, at the audition. I didn't laugh, but I didn't stop them either. I'm sorry." Elena smiled, her eyes kind. "You're here now. That's what counts." Lily clutched her sheet music, emboldened. "What you did, it changed things. People are talking about the scholarship, about Keller, about you." "I didn't do it for me," Elena said, adjusting the strap of her violin case. "I did it for him, and for anyone who's ever been told they don't belong." As she walked away, her silhouette framed against the setting sun, Lily overheard a passing student whisper to another, "She doesn't need the spotlight. She is the light." Elena's steps didn't falter. She had no need for their praise, no desire for their redemption. She carried Keller's music within her, and that was enough. If this story made your heart pause, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more.